Okay, great. Welcome, everybody. Greetings and welcome to this webinar entitled Truth to Power and Power's Untruth, Challenging Silencing Strategies in the Palestinian Struggle. This session has been sponsored by the Arab American Studies Association and is featured as part of the American Studies Association's 2020 program of Freedom Courses. My name is Keith Feldman. I am an associate professor of ethnic studies at UC Berkeley. Today, we are pleased to be joined by an amazing panel of speakers who will offer insights from their own vantage points as scholars, teachers, journalists, and lawyers into the ways a robust engagement with Palestine's histories and futures continues to be a fiercely contested terrain of struggle in the United States. We're also joined by two ASL interpreters, Keturah Holliday and Brandon Heaps. Thank you so much for your work. One bit of digital housekeeping. We are first staging this webinar as a YouTube live event and hope to post a recording of it on the ASA's Freedom Courses channel. Please note that if you're tuning in live, we've attempted to turn off the chat and comment functions due to our own limited capacity and bandwidth to manage those aspects of the program. Okay, we have a limited amount of time and a packed agenda, so let's get right to it. I've been pleased to co-organize this session with Dr. Omar Zaza. Omar is the Education and Advocacy Coordinator for Eyewitness Palestine, a member of the Palestinian Youth Movement and an independent scholar who holds a PhD in comparative literature from UCLA. Omar will serve as the lead moderator for today's session, while I'll do my best to work the production booth. Let me go ahead and turn it over to Omar.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you to Keturah for providing the interpretation. And thank you to all of us who've joined us today, and especially our esteemed panelists. We do have a full schedule, as Keith mentioned. I want to keep these comments brief to allow maximum time for them to share their crucial insights. But I do think it's prudent to reflect for a minute about the nature of this panel and how its origin was in some ways a culmination of the relentless attacks to which Palestine work on and off campus has been subjected. And in other ways, merely a symptom rather than a culmination. Because when the Arab American Studies Association came up with an idea for a panel in response to the executive order of the Trump administration that seemed to codify the logic that speaking out for Palestinian liberation was somehow continuous with violating civil rights, many of us who had been used to the strategy of claiming work on behalf of Palestinian freedom and liberation from oppression was itself a form of oppression. So we knew really that in this moment it was only the scale and not the nature of the tactic that was somewhat different. Because ultimately, we knew that Trump's successes could at times serve as a distraction for how, in fact, the silencing and repression of the Palestinian liberation struggle and narrative is a question of the very foundation of a settler colonial and racist US political and cultural establishment. Thus, we knew the executive order was just one drop in a very big ocean, and today our problems will be no less pronounced with the Biden-Harris administration, even if the challenges will now commence with a more cosmetic liberal gleam. Even with the resignation of Kenneth Marcus from the Office of Civil Rights and the seeming end of a Trump administration, at least in a good chunk, the Palestinian liberation struggle remains no less challenged by colonial logics that seek to criminalize and repress the very expression of Palestinian narratives, resilience, and resistance. The scandal is not just individual, but epistemic, and so we must draw direct connections between the ongoing blacklisting of organizers and activists for Palestine through insidious campaigns like Canary Mission, the ongoing attempts to ban Arab American studies in Palestine from ethnic studies programming in the state of California, the ongoing spate of anti-BDS legislation cropping up at the state level, as well as the recent work of big tech, Zoom specifically, to directly censor an open classroom co-hosted by the Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diasporas program and the Women and Gender Studies programs at San Francisco State University, dedicated to gender justice and liberation, that featured Palestinian resistance icon Leila Khalid. As the Palestine feminist group rightly noted in a statement in opposition to this censorship, it illustrates an ongoing attempts to silence Palestinian narratives, and specifically Palestinian feminist narratives, that elevate not only the voices of women who have played a foundational role in our historical struggles for liberation, but more generally a gendered analysis of our ongoing struggle for freedom from patriarchal violence and the machinery of settler colonial dispossession. This is a systemic issue. All forms of repression, no matter how seemingly distinct, are linked by the symbolic need to eliminate resistance and agency of the colonized. Therefore, we need to remain steadfast in drawing and redrawing the links between the ongoing colonization of the land that we see playing out in Palestine and the attempts to silence and repress Palestinian voices and narratives of resilience and repression. So, with that, I think we'll turn to our panelists to hear their own experiences, recommendations, and insights about these issues just outlined. Now, I'll be reading bios in the order of speaker appearance, but just as a reminder, today we will be joined by Rabab Abdulhadi, Rani Allen, Nora Barrows-Friedman, Zoha Khalili, Tomomi Kinokawa, David Lloyd, and Bill Mullen. And now I'll commence with the bio of our first speaker. David Lloyd, Distinguished Professor of English at the University of California, Riverside, is a poet, playwright, and critic working primarily on Irish culture and on post-colonial and cultural theory. His most recent critical books include Beckett's Thing, Painting and Theater, and Underrepresentation, The Racial Regime of Aesthetics. His writings on Palestine and BDS can be found in Settler Colonial Studies, Mondawais, Jadalia, Los Angeles Review of Books, and other outlets. And he is currently a member of the advisory board of US ACB. With that, please join me in welcoming Professor David Lloyd.
Hello, everybody, and thanks to Omar and Keith for putting on this panel at such an important moment as we make, hopefully, the transition from the Trump regime, which introduced its executive order to suppress sensitivity training, so-called, to the Biden regime, which will, as Keith and Omar have said, be no less unsympathetic to the Palestinian cause. In addressing the issues before us today, I thought it might be best to take things back to principle and history rather than simply focusing on the latest egregious censorship of Rabab Abdulhadi's class in San Francisco State University. There has, of course, been a lot of chatter on the right, particularly about what they call cancel culture. And it would, of course, if we were not so inured to hypocrisy, be a distinct irony that the people who complain about cancel culture are not particularly worried by Zoom's censorship and indeed Facebook's censorship of this particular class on the grounds that it was engaging with Palestine solidarity and that that was an act of terrorism. There's something, however, that the cancel culture rhetoric seems to me to forget, which is a fundamental distinction between censorship and censure. Censure has always been a fundamental aspect of civil society as it emerged in modern times. That is, censure was always engaged in the critique of the establishment, the critique of the state, and was in that respect completely distinct from censorship, which was, of course, the work of institutions that had the power to censor people's speech and people's actions. We are very familiar with the aspect of censorship in the Palestine solidarity movement. It was famously always the third rail of public discourse, as Edward Said once defined it quite some time ago. It was, of course, closed out of public discourse almost entirely by a hegemonic form of censure. It was simply that which could not be spoken in polite discourse and did not require the intervention of the state to enforce this effective censorship by moral censure of Palestine solidarity. If we reflect a little bit on the history of the BDS movement, we'll be reminded that the BDS movement has always cast itself not as an instrument of state policy, but rather as the mobilization of civil society movements. It's supported by some 170 Palestinian civil society movements, not in the first place by the Palestinian Authority. And it is, of course, our aim in the BDS movement to try to stimulate civil society to speak of and to learn about the conditions under which Palestinians live under Israeli blockade, under Israeli occupation, and under the fundamentally discriminatory regime of the Israeli state itself. As a civil society movement, we came into being, and I speak here primarily for USACB, of which I was a founding member, we came into being precisely because the movement within the political sphere was completely blocked to us. It was impossible to get Congress to move, even in the most fundamental ways, to protect Palestinian rights or to protect Palestinians from the slaughter that was being inflicted on them by successive attacks on Gaza in particular. It is, in other words, a battle for civil society to take up hegemony in the cause of Palestinians, and its instrument is censure. Its instrument is the critique of the Israeli state for its fundamental breach of international law and its fundamental violations of human rights. That is the work that we have been doing, and every tactic that we've used, from bringing the ASA, for example, or the Asian American Studies Association to promote the boycott, to the bringing of speakers to churches, to mobilize churches like the Presbyterian Church of the United States to engage in boycott. Each of those tactics, each of those sites of struggle has been about trying to raise public awareness. And it's clear that in that we have succeeded. And it's clear that as a result of that success, over the 10 years or so, at least since USACB was formed, and the 15 years, or over 15 years since the BDS movement itself started, that success is what has led the Zionist movements to try to censor us. That censorship, of course, is primarily led by the charge that Palestinian solidarity is fundamentally anti-Semitic, hence the charge that it's discriminatory and a violation of civil rights that was mentioned before. Anti-Semitism has always, of course, been mobilized against Palestinians. Now, however, the mode of censure that the charge of anti-Semitism was supposed to represent, a censure of an immoral and racist affect and discourse, is being mobilized not for the purposes of critique, but for the purpose of censorship. We can see that quite clearly in two forms. The first being, of course, the deliberate confusion in the definition of anti-Semitism with the critique of Israel itself. That a critique of a state is in fact anti-Semitic is on its face absurd, as you will recognize the moment you substitute the name of another state and say that, say, the critique of the state of Nigeria is anti-blackness. This state appropriation of the definition of anti-Semitism in the cause of censorship has, of course, also been taken up by universities. But I think it's very important to recognize that every movement of censorship produces an opposite and equal reaction. There is what I've called in the past a Zionist megaphone, which is lent to us by these activities of censorship, that are resisted and actually provide a platform for us to promote our own agenda, which is the transformation of BDS from being a marginal to a highly public and indeed even hegemonic perspective. BDS exists to shift to public opinion in order that we may create new possibilities for political transformation. And it's my hope that this panel today will actually affect, in its own small way, a part of that transformation of public discourse and use that Zionist megaphone once again to promote the ideas of justice for Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, David. I'm now going to introduce our next speaker, Ronnie Allen. Ronnie Allen is the founder and a coordinator of the Law Students for Justice in Palestine at George Washington University, where he is a 2L. Coming from a family of Palestinian refugees himself, he is a fierce advocate for the right of return of Palestinian refugees. He worked with Palestine and Palestinian Syrian refugees in Lebanon for 3 different summers. He was denied entry by Israel into Palestine twice and banned. He co-founded and was the president of the Palestine Solidarity Alliance at Hunter College, where he co-founded the university's system-wide Apartheid Divest CUNY campaign. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Ronnie Allen.
Greetings, y'all. Thank you, Omar. Thank you, Kenneth. Thank you, Katura and Brandon, for setting up this incredible panel. And I want to thank the other speakers for making it here today as well. I want to begin by highlighting some of the biggest obstacles law students are currently facing on law school campuses. Normally, before COVID-19, there were regularly organized trips by organizations such as one called ITRAC. ITRAC is this organization that started in 2012 that aims to take graduate students on trips to Palestine and Israel to take them around ethnically cleansed land and under what it calls showing them both perspectives. And we're familiar with trips like this on undergraduate campuses. We are familiar with trips like Birthright that aim to whitewash the Israeli occupation by recruiting young people to go on these trips that are usually highly subsidized. And these ITRAC trips that aim to recruit law students from across the country are branded as being fun, adventurous, usually held during spring trips, and they tell the students that they're gonna be familiar with both sides and that they're gonna witness the situation firsthand. Now, ITRAC, they aim to send or target graduate students and law students because they know that law students are going to be the future leaders of tomorrow, that we are the ones that are going to carry on the weight of reshaping policy. And that is why they have a high presence on campus. That is why they have presence on every university campus. They know the potential that we have, and that's particularly why a couple of law schools with SGP chapters like NYU Law School and UC Berkeley Law School have issued public statements or have active campaigns against ITRAC trips. There are campuses like the University of Chicago that started PaliTrack as an alternative to ITRAC. Now, why don't these organizations organize trips to shed light on the right of return, on the plight of over 7 million Palestinian refugees. Instead, they take these law students on military tours to go to the occupied Golden Heights of Syria, to the occupied West Bank, and just throw propaganda on them, while trying to frame it as being receptive to both sides. But what's missing here is that these conversations during these trips, the itineraries of these trips, are still heavily controlled and regulated to an extent to whitewash Israel's crimes. They cherry pick the people they want you to meet. They will let you meet a couple of Palestinians, but usually these Palestinians are serving a narrative that they're particularly looking for. Like, for example, they would organize a meeting with Palestinian businessmen who have ties with the Palestinian Authority, and while they might critique in a few sentences Israeli policies, it's still not like to the point where it would actually highlight to you the extent of the Israeli crimes. And the more you look into these trips like ITRAC, the more you see the funding that can come from sketchy sources, and the mission of these trips to whitewash Israeli crimes. And we are in need of more law schools, of more graduate schools like NYU Law School SGP, like UC Berkeley SGP, and right now GW SGP, to have active campaigns, to issue public statements against ITRAC and against similar organizations trying to recruit future leaders of tomorrow. And the American Studies Association, it stands as an honorary, exemplary model of an organization that has refused to bow down to Israeli whitewashing efforts by passing its resolution in favor of cutting ties with Israeli academic institutions in 2016. And that should be the role of every U.S. institution. That should be the role of every U.S. campus, which have a very long way of ending complicity with the Israeli occupation. And the military, the apartheid apparatus. One side is the so-called war rooms that are organized on Israeli university campuses. Omar, you were mentioning earlier Canary Mission, and these war rooms that are held at Israeli university campuses are just one example of how much violence, as opposed to liberalizing education, that gets promoted and launched from Israeli university campuses, that we are in need of boycotting. From these war rooms, there are people that go and defend Israeli war crimes on online social media, that go and blacklist students. I'm sure they have ties to Canary Mission. There are other blacklist websites as well, like Radical Alert, and it's literally like waging a war from these war rooms. They wage these online wars against Palestine students, against student activists. Again, because they know the potential that exists on these campuses, and it's because of these war rooms that we are in need of an actual affirmative stance, being neutral, or just taking a step aside is not going to prevent the harassment of Palestinian students and students of color and students who are vocal of the Palestinian struggle, because you need to have an affirmative stance to protect the fundamental rights of Palestinian students. Boycotting ITRAC trips also demonstrates that students can partake in BDS activities beyond just divestment. Boycotting these trips is a form of a boycott, an academic boycott, a cultural boycott. And I want more students to be aware that to engage in BDS activities on campus, you don't have to only rely on a referendum or a student government resolution that calls for divestment from companies profiting off of Israeli war crimes. There are also several other ways of launching BDS campaigns, such as targeting pro-Israel trips that are organized on your campus. Because of how large the extent is of cooperation between US university campuses and the Israeli apartheid state. So research what ties your school has of organizations, agencies, institutions, or companies that are profiting off of Israeli war crimes or attempting to whitewash them, like the pro-Israel trips. And the struggle for Palestine on campus is inextricably linked to decentralizing the power of those in charge on our campuses, particularly the board of trustees and the administrations. And it's inextricably linked to having accessibility for everyone, having access to academic resources, in addition to taking influence away from authoritarian foreign governments like the Israeli foreign government. It means also taking control of our campuses to share resources with the community, particularly those who cannot afford to access those institutions. It means letting in the marginalized, opening our events to the public, having our universities become accessible to people with disabilities, as well as incorporating disability justice into our work. That includes mental and physical disability. We shouldn't allow the upper and middle classes to continue to maintain universities as a complex of social networks that perpetuate the hegemony of mental and physical normalcy in our social institutions. And lastly, I want to shed light on my undergraduate university divestment campaign that faced a lot of attacks. Recently, 2 campuses of this 26 campus-wide university system passed resolutions in favor of divestment, and they are the City College of New York and the Borough of Manhattan Community College. Lots of power to the students who were organizing that. And during the CUNY apartheid divestment campaign, there were undercover spies. There were tweets being spread around by the Israeli government against the university-wide divestment resolution. There were a lot of Zionists coming to the university student senate meetings, attacking student senators, accusing them of being biased, of taking a stance, just for wanting to hold a hearing in favor of the divestment resolution. There were a lot of student senators that faced harassment, especially online harassment, death threats, simply for just being a member of the student senate. They didn't even have any vocalized stances in favor of the divestment. Simply for being a member of the student senate, they were targeted a lot. They had leaked recordings of them published online. And this was allowed because CUNY, the City University of New York, is a public university. So literally anyone can just enter the meetings, regardless if they're a CUNY member or just anyone, and they can record those meetings, and then they can go and publish those meetings online, and then you can go and see these recordings on websites like Canary Mission, on other websites that I don't even want to name, and it's hurts students, especially where CUNY is majority working class, especially where the students impacted were just young working class students who all what they had to do was just being members of the student senate. But nevertheless, I don't want to end without mentioning how much success and how much strength these attacks provided us. As I mentioned earlier, the divestment resolution was passed on 2 individual CUNY campuses, even though the university-wide resolution didn't pass in 2018. There were 2 individual campus resolutions that passed last year, and the campaign has mobilized a lot of students, has influenced a lot of students to take action in just a matter of 2 to 3 years. So that deserves to not go unmentioned. And surely the students right now are more energized than the students were in 2016 when the campaign first started.
Thank you so much, Rani, for also reminding us of the student context, the student activist and organizing context, in addition to everything else that you touched on. So I'll go ahead and introduce our next speaker, who now, interestingly, transitioning from student activism to the legal context. We're going to be hearing from Zoha Khalili, a staff attorney at Palestine Legal. At Palestine Legal, Zoha Khalili provides legal advice and advocacy support to activists, students, and professors on issues ranging from free speech violations and disciplinary charges to discrimination, threats, and surveillance. Welcome, Zoha.
Hi, thank you so much for having me here. I think that a lot of what I'm talking about here might be repetitive of what's already been spoken about and what will be spoken about in the future by people who are being directly impacted here. But I want to just provide an overview from a more distant legal perspective. The work that we do at Palestine Legal is within the framework of something called movement lawyering, where, we try to ensure that we're not attempting to, we don't have this idea that we're going to be able to change the world through law. What we're trying to do is create space for activists, be they students, professors, individuals throughout society, to be able to speak about issues, to educate others, and to organize and take collective action to actually create change. And because we're seeing people being targeted through legal mechanisms or through mechanisms that are somehow connected with the law, our work is to try to block that those attacks from taking place, to actually create that space. And so, the Israeli government understands that as people learn about the reality of what is going on in Palestine, it's not going to be able to get away with impunity and this, undying loyalty from the U.S. government and the funding that it's getting from the U.S. government that is really unconditional. And the government in Israel is allowed to do whatever it wants without facing any kind of consequences or sanctions from the US government. And so, as Americans become more aware of what is being done with our tax dollars, there's this threat to the Israeli government and in not being able to get away with its human rights violations. And so the Israeli government and its supporters have been trying to really eliminate the ability of people to have conversations here in the United States and to educate people people about the realities of what's taking place. And, you know, there's a few different tactics that have been used, but essentially the approach that has been taken is to try to ostracize people by, you know, branding them as terrorists or anti-Semites, creating these false accusations, blacklisting sites like Canary Mission, that, you know, it's literally a blacklist of people who are engaged in activism, students, professors, organizations, through these like attempts at 6 degrees of separation from terrorism accusations. They try to brand everyone on that website as a racist and try to prevent them from having access to job opportunities and to graduate school, and, you know, to create a situation where people are afraid to speak out because they're afraid that they're going to be added to this list that will brand them as racist. The tagline for the website is, if you're racist, you should know. And so you know, people it creates a situation where there is an exacerbation of the privilege that people already have when speaking out. So Palestinians, for example, are often afraid that they are added to Canary Mission. They are going to pause. It seems like we're in an ASL transition. Nope. Okay, I'm gonna continue. I apologize. Okay. I'm just gonna continue speaking. So it creates a situation where Palestinians in particular, are afraid to speak out because they're not going to be able to go home. Hi, Keith.
Hi, Zoha. Sorry, there seems to be some audio interference on your channel.
Okay. Let me try just speaking at the computer then.
Okay. Yeah, let's try that.
Is this better?
Oh, yes, that sounds great.
Okay, I am so sorry about that.
No problem.
Yeah, so it's, you know, it's creating this unbalanced situation where people who are already comfortable with their situation in society feel more able to speak out, and people who are more vulnerable are less able to speak out. And it often results in Palestinians not being able to speak out for themselves because they're afraid that, you know, when they're trying to enter Palestine, Israel is going to look at Canary Mission, see that they're involved in activism, and not allow them to enter into the country. And similarly, when they are, you know,
You can continue, Zoha. We're just, yes.
I feel bad going with the ASL taking place. Okay.
Back on in just a moment.
Okay, so yeah, so I'm gonna move on from Canary Mission. But anyway, so, you know, it is creating a situation where people are not able to speak out for themselves because they are afraid that their names are going to be identified. It's going to create problems for their families. You know, it's people who have international student visas, you know, they are afraid that they're not going to be able to enter the country if, when they're trying to apply for a renewal of their visa, that Canary Mission comes up and identifies them as a racist. And so, you know, anyone who has a particular vulnerability is going to feel less comfortable taking part in activism. And so, you know, the other thing I want to talk about was deplatforming. So, you know, there has been this effort to get rid of the spaces that people are able to speak. So there's been lobbying towards Facebook, Zoom, Twitter to try to adopt this definition of anti-Semitism that encompasses criticism of Israel. And so, you know, trying to get them to enforce in their automated policies a removal of Palestinian voices and voices that are speaking about the rights of Palestinians. And, you know, we've already seen that taking place, but it's getting increasingly severe because there are these campaigns that are getting funded by the Israeli government, like a phone app called act.il, which it creates these missions where people are told to do a particular thing. So people are told in masses of individuals to go report a particular post on Facebook or Twitter, or to try to get a YouTube video taken down. And so with these large numbers of people that are following these links and this mission that's being sent out to people around the world, there is this huge response from these tech companies and also from schools where people are also getting targeted. So one situation that we saw this app being used recently was to target a law student at CUNY named Nardine Kiswani, and she posted a video online of her kidding around with a friend of hers. She was holding a lighter up, and she was telling this person who she was speaking with that she wanted to burn his shirt, and he had a shirt with the logo of the Israeli Defense Forces. And she had told him, this is a really problematic shirt, and then she like waved the lighter in front of him. This was a friend of Nardine's, didn't understand what this logo was for, and she was just trying to get across this idea that this is the logo of an occupying army that has, displaced her family and created untold harm. And so she posted this video online, and this app created a mission that was telling people to contact the administration to get her kicked out of school because she was targeting a Jewish student at CUNY and threatening his life. And so, these are not facts, but they created these facts on the ground by having, hundreds or maybe even thousands of people sending letters to the school demanding that she be expelled. And so by creating these numbers, there is this ability to target individuals. So despite the fact that the movement for Palestinian rights is broad-based and decentralized, and there is, growing awareness in society of what is going on, these individualized attacks make it harder for individual activists who become prominent to continue with their activism. And so, it is especially targeting people of color, people who are involved in intersectional work. I think that is an intense concern for people who are supporting Israel. People will, understand that the struggle for Palestinian rights aligns with, for example, Black Lives Matter, with LGBTQ rights, with environmental justice, indigenous rights here in the United States. And people who are involved in these justice struggles are going to be working in partnership with people who are working for Palestinian rights, because they understand that the same forces that are at work here are working hand in hand. So, for example, the same companies that are constructing the border wall here in the United States to separate people from their families in the US and Mexico have constructed the same wall separating Palestinians from their families and from their lands and from access to resources. And so, there is this understanding, particularly with students who are passing divestment resolutions on campus, of the same forces being at work. And so, for example, if students might try to pass a divestment resolution saying that their tuition dollars and the endowments of their universities should not be going towards these companies that are creating private prisons, building border walls, providing surveillance technology to the Israeli government that's going to be used in oppressing Palestinians. And so, these are phenomenally successful because people are understanding the parallelism of these struggles. And so, university administrators are always just immediately ready to condemn these resolutions. We found even during the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, university administrators were taking time to condemn boycott, divestment, and sanctions instead of, focusing on protecting their students and putting policies in place that were going to keep students and faculty and staff safe. And so, we have never seen a university administration to come out and condemn Canary Mission, this clear blacklisting site that is targeting individual students. But, we found students report that immediately after a particular thing is passed in student government, an administrator is on hand with a prepared statement to condemn that resolution. And so there is this really huge imbalance of power that is really exacerbating the situation and preventing people from being able to communicate with each other. And that's something that at our organization we call the Palestine exception to free speech, that, when you're talking about Palestine, there is a separate set of rules that are being imposed. And so there are two case studies that I kind of wanted to talk about, the different tactics that are used for silencing. And so the first of those is just the American Studies Association. Many of you who are watching this webinar might be familiar or even involved with some of these issues, but after the American Studies Association passed its boycott resolution, it was a phenomenally successful resolution supported by a 2-to-1 vote. There was legislation that was introduced in multiple states trying to prevent universities from funding people's membership in the American Studies Association, their travel, participation in conferences, or any kind of academic institution, if that academic institution has a resolution supporting the boycott for Palestinian rights. And so these were introduced. None of them were actually passed. There were resolutions that condemned the ASA's boycott resolution, but there was a lot of recognition that the legislation that was trying to undermine the funding for institutions in order to prevent people from participating in these academic groups was a threat to academic freedom and a violation of the First Amendment. So the binding laws didn't pass, but these resolutions that condemned the ASA did pass. There were multiple lawsuits that were launched against members of the ASA board and leadership after the resolution was passed. And so these lawsuits keep getting thrown out, but they keep being brought in different forums. And something that happened really recently was that a professor at the University of Michigan was asked to write a letter of recommendation for a program in Israel. And so as part of the academic boycott, he decided that he was not going to put his labor into furthering this program, and that he wasn't going to provide a letter of recommendation to that student for that particular program. There was huge outrage against that decision, and he was punished. He was denied, I think, a sabbatical that he was due to have. And the school instituted a policy limiting people's ability to decide whether or not they were going to provide a letter of recommendation to their students, and essentially like taking the volition of faculty away from themselves and creating a situation where it's just like this commodity that's being dispensed to their students. And so, these are a lot of different approaches to trying to punish people for this particular action. Similarly, let's see, which one do I want to talk about? At the University of North Carolina and Duke, there was a conference that was held talking about ASA, and it was an academic conference, had experts from across disciplines talking about the situation there, recognizing that, it's an unlivable situation. This was even before the COVID-19 crisis, but people, being in lockdown in the largest open air prison in the world, this was just an academic conference talking about the realities on the ground there. And there was attacks on the institutions that were involved in that conference. So first there was an attack on the academic programs, and the institutions were told that, they had to change their approach to, teaching about Islam and other religions in the Middle East, or they would be denied funding for the entire Center for Middle East Studies on campus. And so, there was outcry against the micromanagement of those programs, but there was a second investigation that was then launched under the Civil Rights Act. So, we spoke earlier about the definition of anti-Semitism that was adopted by Donald Trump that tries to encompass criticism of Israel. But this investigation was looking under civil rights laws, whether the existence of this conference created a hostile environment for Jewish students. And, the investigation was never concluded. The institutions decided that this was not worth their effort to engage in this battle. And so, they agreed to adopt a definition of anti-Semitism for use in their non-discrimination laws, and to create forums for people to submit their complaints about discrimination on campus. And so these are, non-problematic things that, we expect institutions to fight against anti-Semitism and to create a safe environment for their students to have equal access to education. But this was coming from a place where anti-Semitism was being defined to include activism for Palestinian rights. And so there was a particular student on campus that has been repeatedly targeted since Duke entered into this agreement because of her online postings in support of Palestinian rights. And so pro-Israel students on campus have complained, for example, that she posted an image of them with emojis covering their faces. They complained that they felt dehumanized and under threat because of that. And she was called in for a meeting over her, off-campus online postings. And we've seen that increasingly happen where people are being targeted for these online postings and questioned by their administrators. They're not punished because there is no basis for punishing them, but it does create this vague, chilling impact that is preventing people from being able to speak. And so, there's a ton of things that I would love to talk about, but I think what's most important is to understand that, these efforts are largely unsuccessful in terms of, achieving the goals that they're trying to achieve. The movement for Palestinian rights has been very successful. It's become increasingly mainstream, and people are becoming increasingly aware of the realities on the ground. But, the way that these efforts have been effective is in creating this cloud of criminality and punishment and risk and danger that is causing particular people to remove themselves from those conversations, to find that it's easier to remain silent on this issue. And so, the more those people are remaining silent and withdrawing themselves from those conversations, the less successful the movement is going to be. And I think it's really important for people to continue to speak out, and to for people who are in positions of privilege, people who have tenure, people who have racial and religious and gender privilege, to be speaking out about these issues and creating space for those underprivileged voices to also be able to speak out. So when people are targeted to, sign petitions, to show up to protest, to show these numbers, because there are numbers that are being artificially drummed up on the other side. And it creates the situation where administrators, for example, think it's easier to just agree to punish this one person rather than facing the outrage of thousands of people. And so it's very important to speak out for each other. If anyone runs into any kinds of issues about their activism for Palestinian rights, please reach out to Palestine Legal to see if there is something we can do to support you. I can provide information about that maybe in like a YouTube comment later on. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Zoha. Palestine Legal remains very much an essential component in terms of supporting students, activists, professors, and in general, anyone who faces repression and backlash around the question of Palestine. So definitely do look into them and continue to support them if you're engaged in or sympathetic to this type of work. So next I'll be introducing Nora Barrows-Friedman. Nora Barrows-Friedman is an associate editor of the Electronic Intifada and has been reporting on Palestine and Palestinian human rights issues for nearly 20 years. She is also a longtime radio broadcaster and co-hosts the Electronic Intifada podcast. Nora is the author of Inner Power, U.S. Students Organized for Justice in Palestine. Welcome, Nora. I think you're muted.
Sorry. You'd think that 8 months of lockdown and Zoom meetings would remind me a little bit more to unmute myself. I'm just so honored and privileged to be amongst this group of panelists, most, I think all of whom I've worked with in some capacity or another over the last 10 years that I've been at the Electronic Intifada. And, Zoha mentioned that what Palestine Legal does is like movement lawyering. And we at the Electronic Intifada like to say that we're in movement journalism as well. And really, I think it's so important now more than ever for activists and students and faculty to be, looking for alternative platforms for independent media. I think, like Edward Said said, Palestine remains a third rail in corporate media. There's, the amount of times that I have seen and witnessed and been involved in, really banging our heads against the wall, trying to get the New York Times or the Washington Post or, NBC to cover accurately what's happening in Palestine and what's happening here in the U.S. and U.S. policy toward Israel and Palestine. It remains this, really like a revolving door or, a shift change when we see these, supposedly, objective reporters, even though I don't really believe that objective journalism is really a thing, but these, supposed objective reporters reporting from, the ground in Jerusalem, then, becoming we just saw this past week, Ruth Eglash, who was the correspondent for the Washington Post in Jerusalem, She is now transitioning, a shift change to propagandizing for Gilad Erdan, who, as many of you might know, he was the head of the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs, and now is going to be the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations. And Ruth Eglash is now going to be his spokesperson. And it's significant for so many reasons. Gilad Erdan and the Ministry of Strategic Affairs is something that we've been reporting on for many, many years. The ministry was tasked fundamentally and explicitly with combating, censoring, smearing the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign, and also helping or working with Israel lobby organizations here in the States and in Europe to clamp down on BDS activism, especially on campuses. The Israeli government and all these Israel lobby organizations had been targeting U.S. campuses in particular as, the battleground for destroying, disrupting, and censoring the BDS movement. And so it's significant that, we have these corporate reporters like Ruth Eglash, doing this revolving door thing to becoming explicitly an Israeli propagandist, as she was before her post at the Washington Post. She, I believe, was the editor-in-chief of the far right-wing Jerusalem Post. So we see this, and it's incredibly frustrating for students who I speak to all the time. I'm sure Zoha does as well, who are being interviewed about their action on campuses, from New York to California, and they are being misquoted or smeared, kind of implicitly or explicitly. And I think it's more important than ever to support independent journalism, especially when it involves what's happening in academia. We can, just an example of what the mainstream media is deliberately leaving out as this third rail sort of, example is just in the past couple of months here in California, the ethnic studies model curriculum, which has been under sustained attack from Israel lobby forces for years. But there was a bill in the California State Assembly that would mandate ethnic studies as a required graduation requirement for high schoolers at California public high schools. And, it was a pretty boilerplate bill, even though it had been watered down significantly. Several Israel lobby organizations had pressured California state lawmakers to put in guardrails, especially around Arab American studies. That would soften the edges, let's say, of criticism of Israel or of teaching Palestinian history. So it was significantly watered down, but it was kind of a shoo-in for it to pass. And Governor Gavin Newsom vetoed it when it passed. He vetoed it. And a lot of corporate media around California, kind of just said, oh, well, Governor Newsom said he had some issues with it, and just kind of left it at that. But what independent sources and what members of faculty and what students were saying, and activists for ethnic studies, people who had been involved in the fight for ethnic studies for the last 50 years, rightly exposed the fact that these Israel lobby organizations were heavily pressuring the governor to veto, even though they had gotten, kind of, a modicum of what they wanted by having it watered down. It wasn't enough. it's never enough, like as we saw with the attacks against Jeremy Corbyn. You cannot give the Israel lobby organizations an inch. They will not stop. They will keep coming back and keep demanding more. And that's what we saw here. So Newsom vetoed the bill. And then just, a couple weeks later, Tony Thurmond, the superintendent of California public education in the state, announced that he was going to be working with the Simon Wiesenthal Center, which is a far-right Israel lobby organization that kind of brands itself as, a civil rights organization, much like the Anti-Defamation League. Really, you like under the cloak of protecting civil rights and equality and, all of these types of liberal words, they use it to advance Israeli agendas and silence Palestinian rights. So Tony Thurmond announced he was going to be working with the Simon Wiesenthal Center to author and put forth a sort of anti-hate, anti-bias curriculum that would serve, they claim, as sort of an antidote to Trump's executive order, denouncing anti-racist, theory, critical race theory. So, that then, as California lawmakers usually do, once they're under pressure by Israel lobby organizations, they capitulate. They do whatever these Israel lobby organizations want, and it is always the students and the members of faculty who suffer. In terms of the ethnic studies model curriculum, it is Arab American studies is once again under severe attack. In the same week or two that Tony Thurmond announced this so-called anti-bias curriculum, he also pushed Arab American studies literally into the appendix of the ethnic studies model curriculum, which must be approved and passed by the state legislature in March. So we see this continuing trouncing of Palestinian Americans and the right to read about and organize with the knowledge of their history and the fact-based context of colonialism and resistance to that colonialism. And it's it's stunning, and I think a very cautionary tale to other academics and people who are involved in education across the US. I think California continues to be a test case, whether it's the University of California system, whose regents have worked with, again, the Simon Wiesenthal Center and other Israel lobby organizations to try and clamp down on Palestine rights organizing on campuses, or whether it's high school students missing out on critical ethnic studies curricula because Israel lobby organizations and the Israeli government itself don't want people to learn, students to learn about Palestinian history and the links between colonialism here on this continent and in Palestine. So I wanted finally just to talk about also the utility of Zoom in academia. I just published a story yesterday, actually, featuring some members of USACB, who are professors at the University of Hawaii and NYU, who were shut down by Zoom. There was a USACB Day of Action that was called on October 23rd to protest the cancellation and censorship by Zoom exactly a month earlier of Professor Abdul Hadi and Professor Kinakawa's panel featuring Leila Khaled. And Zoom, you know, it's so dangerous that Zoom is now becoming the arbiter of what can and can't be taught in classrooms, in universities. That a private company it has so much power now, you know, under lockdown, and that university administrations are prioritizing their contracts with Zoom over, you know, over the academic freedom in their classrooms. I think it's really dangerous. And in talking with professors and students, you know, one student, Nurdin Kiswani, who Zoha mentioned at CUNY Law, she told me for that story that it is necessary to stop organizing on private property, right? So to stop relying on these private corporations like Zoom and Facebook and YouTube, which have all, you know, and Twitter, which have all at some point or another, you know, have censored Palestinians and Palestinian voices and Palestinian narratives, to figure out alternative platforms in the short run, but also to really pressure university administrations to understand that you can't just censor a voice that a certain outside political group or country doesn't like, and it is not the university's place to smear an entire community as anti-Semitic or terrorist just because, you know, a private corporation says so, or Israel, you know, lobby organizations demand it. So there's a lot of work to do, and you know, I'm always so impressed with members of faculty and students and other educators who are taking this on and continue to be resilient and tenacious, and really, you know, trying to remind their university administrations that free speech is still a thing, First Amendment is still a right. And I'm incredibly appreciative of organizations like Palestine Legal that does that work, that is there to remind administrations that, you know, that it's unacceptable and illegal to censor speech on Palestine.
Thank you so much, Nora. And I just want to give a quick reminder to some of the viewers that, again, this is a panel that's made up of people representing multiple occupations, multiple different contexts, because the type of repression and silencing we're talking about, likewise, right, is multidisciplinary, multi-contextual, and spans a wide range. So it's in the spirit of bringing together different forms of expertise, different strategies and recommendations, and calls for solidarity based on particular needs, so we can continue to work together in joint struggle to offset this type of repression. Next, I'll be introducing Bill Mullen. Bill V. Mullen is Professor Emeritus of American Studies at Purdue. He's a member of the organizing collective for USACB, the U.S. campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel. He's the co-editor with Ashley Dawson of Against Apartheid, The Case for Boycotting Israeli Universities. He's also the author of James Baldwin, Living in Fire. He has been active in several BDS campaigns, including the successful vote by the American Studies Association in 2013 to boycott Israeli universities. Welcome, Bill.
Thanks, Omar. And thanks, Omar and Keith, for organizing today. It's really an honor to be with so many people who've done so much, I think, for Palestinian liberation struggle, especially in the United States. I feel sort of a personal debt to Zoha and Nora here from EI and Legal, because, you know, in my own experience on campus and with students over the past 10 years, they've been essential sources for standing up and doing both movement legal work and movement journalism. So I think they're just examples of the kind of institution building that's been part of the narrative of counter struggle that we're all talking about today, that's taken place, especially over the last 10 years. And I just wanted to try to provide a kind of modest timeline or some thoughts on what's happened over the last 10 years that have brought us to this moment. And I would argue, first of all, that, you know, slowly but surely we're winning. We're mainstreaming Palestinian civil rights struggle in this country through the kinds of efforts that have been described today. And we're also seeing a really productive gap created by the movement between what I would call states and the people. It's really clear now that US support for Israel is being rejected by massive numbers of people in the United States right now. And I want to talk a little bit about how and why I think that's come to be. If I remember back to 2008, when Obama was elected and became the president that, you know, gave the largest chunk of money to Israel that any country, the United States, has ever given to any country in the world. Even before he was inaugurated, Israel invaded Gaza, we'll all remember, in Operation Cast Lead. And that was a bloody massacre that lasted several weeks. But in 2009, many people who had witnessed the bombings there began to kind of, take note of what was going on. And it was in 2009, I believe, David Lloyd, that, that the US ACB was formed, which was the US wing of PACB, which was the Palestinian Academic and Cultural Boycott Movement. And I think these moments are in productive relationship to each other, because it was clear to a lot of people at the university that the time was now in 2009 to stand up and began to support Palestinian civil society. And from 2009 to about 2014, and several people have referenced the American Studies boycott, resolution, which was 2013, we really began to see the shift on the ground. We began to see at universities, students and faculty signing their names to the US ACB pledge to boycott Israeli universities and beginning to grow grassroots struggles on campuses. I really recommend everybody read Nora's book, In Our Power, which is an oral history of the rise of SJPs in this country, Students for Justice in Palestine. I think Nora says there's about, at the time she wrote the book, about 250 chapters. That is such an important part of how we got to where we are. I often think of SJPs for Palestinian civil rights as like what SNCC was in the early 60s, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committees, grassroots student movements that just single-mindedly pushed and have pushed BDS and I think are largely responsible for the number of campuses, dozens and dozens, that have passed resolutions over the past 10 years. And similarly, the American Studies resolution to boycott wasn't a one-off event, right? We actually followed the Association of Asian American Studies, and we were followed by other groups like the National Women's Studies Association, the Critical Ethnic Studies Association, the African Literature Association. And suddenly there was this, this moment in which the world was waking up. And I remember, the New York Times wrote a short front page story about the American Studies Association boycott resolution. And we were all like, wow, this is starting to matter. And that's part of what I mean by the mainstreaming. I mean, the pressure campaigns that have been built from below have begun to get the center to move and recognize and pay attention. Just as we all know that the Israeli state has, brutally ramped up its repression directed against BDS, both within Israel and the US, and the Knesset is spending millions of dollars now to combat it. Those are wins for our side. First they ignore you, then they pay attention, and they try to destroy you. And we're slowly but surely seeing, I think, the fruits of that campaign. Another thing I would relate to the rise of US ACB was the story of Stephen Salaita. I mean, Stephen was offered a position at the University of Illinois Champaign in 2013, tenured position, took the position. And then in 2014, in the summer, the second massive Israeli bombing campaign begins in Gaza, Operation Protective Edge. And as many people remember, Stephen on Twitter and social media condemned the killings, especially the massacre of children. More than 500 Palestinian children were killed in that campaign, and it cost him his job. And Stephen is still an incredible example of what I think Zoha was referring to when she talked about the Palestinian exception to free speech, which has not gone away by any means. But I want to remember the other part of Stephen's story. There was a petition that circulated in support of Stephen, condemning the University of Illinois administration for firing him. And it gathered 20,000 signatures. I mean, that is such an impossible thing to imagine happening in the academy 10, 15 years ago. And I think it's part of that groundswell of recognition that Palestinian human rights matter and need to matter, and that people who are dedicated freedom fighters should be down with that struggle. Several people have mentioned Canary Mission, and I, like everybody here, I suspect we're all on it, and I don't like to talk about Canary Mission, but I want to say it's, in a strange way, its presence is another sign of our victory. It was the hundreds, if not thousands, of students on campuses who began to join SJPs that demanded a repressive mechanism like Canary Mission to try to intimidate them into silence. And it's been effective, we have to admit it. When I was advisor for Purdue SJP, our entire chapter, name by name, went up on Canary Mission. And within about a year's time, it was really hard to keep a chapter going. And in that period, and one of the things I want to talk about is the creativity with which people have tried to resist this repression. A bunch of people, some of them involved with US ACBI, some with Jewish Voice for Peace, some with US Campaign for Palestinian Rights, got their resources together. And we created a website called Against Canary Mission. And I don't know how many people here know of it. It's not as popular as Amazon, but it was an effort to, we simply invited people who were Palestinian activists to send their own profiles in. Basically, trumpeting the fact that, yes, I'm for Palestinian freedom and I don't have to sit in the dark and talk about it. And it was meant to be, a confidence builder for the movement. It was meant to be a place to literally counter the shame, right, and the harassment the Canary Mission represented. And even the thing that I thought was most significant about that project at the time is we created a petition, sent it around to university campus administrations and faculty. And we got more than 1,000 faculty and administrators to sign their names to say, we will never use information from Canary Mission in consideration for things like admission, right, or hiring on campus. Now, that tells you that there are more people out there that on our side still that we haven't even reached, right? That people are almost sometimes looking for a place to plug in their support. And I say that because I think even though Canary Mission continues to impact us, it's also beginning, I think, to be exposed by, again, journalism. If anybody here has seen the Al Jazeera documentary, The Lobby, it does a superb job of kind of using undercover investigative tools to show you exactly how Canary Mission works, how it's funded, and why it's so insidious. And that kind of journalistic attention, and which Nora was referencing, is really, really critical to, again, what I'm calling this mainstreaming of dissidents and protection of the right to dissent on Palestine in the United States. Coming up more recently to the present, and I'm really looking forward to hearing Tamomi and Rabab talk about what happened recently at San Francisco State. And I was glad that Nora referenced the US ACBI demonstration, which was a day of protest to basically get 10 campuses, faculty and students to broadcast footage of Leila Khaled speaking to basically challenge Zoom to try to shut down these events. And they were successful in 3 cases, but unsuccessful in others. And something else that I found really important about the reverberations of that protest was again the attention it received. There's been really good media coverage, obviously in Electronic Intifada where you would expect it, but also The Intercept has just published a very long, very sympathetic story about how critical it is to defend Palestinian free speech in the face of corporate censorship. And even other journalistic outlets. Well, I mean, the one that surprised me the most was the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal wrote a piece talking about Zoom coming under fire for censoring free speech. Well, the Wall Street Journal's a long way, you know, from the next Intifada. But my point is that making noise really matters, right? All the work that people here are doing really matters. If we think discursively about where U.S. politics are now, we've got on one hand, you know, Trump mania and, you know, a kind of rabid Zionism, which is now leaving the White House to be replaced by a friendlier Zionism. But, you know, we do have the presence of Rashida Tlaib and AOC and Ilhan Omar. We've got elected officials now openly supporting not just the right to boycott, but the principles of BDS. We need more electoral wins. We need candidates, right, to continue to defend Palestinian human rights, call for the end of that $38 billion of U.S. military aid. And I think the last thing I would say about the political discourse that in the moment we're in, and this is, you know, very respectful of how dire things are in Palestine now. We should never ignore that. But, you know, if you just look at simple things like polls in the United States, it's really clear that the generation roughly under 30 in this country has a really different perspective on Israel than the generations before. And we're seeing splits in liberal Zionism, which have been produced by our movement, which are incredibly productive. So I think there's still a high ceiling for what we can achieve in struggle. But I also think that we have a lot of work to do, to echo what somebody said earlier. So thanks very much for the chance to speak today.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Bill. The next portion of our programming, I think, is going to be particularly urgent and essential because we're hearing from two very important academics and activists who will speak to a lot of these issues in a way that, from a different context, that I think really needs to be confronted and made explicit so that we can really round out the picture of just what we're talking about when we talk about this type of silencing. So I will now be introducing Professors Tomomi Kinokawa and Rabab Abdulhadi in the orders in which they will come on. And then, if time permits, we may have just a quick, brief discussion about some of these issues. Tomomi Kinokawa is currently a lecturer in the Department of Women's and Gender Studies at SFSU. Kinokawa received a BA in History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Tokyo and a PhD in History of Science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. While teaching courses on feminist and queer theories, Asian American studies, and health education at San Francisco State University and UC Berkeley, Kinokawa has participated in Bay Area grassroots activism as a founding member of the Comfort Women Justice Coalition and a member of Eclipse Rising. Currently, Kinokawa is working on a journal article titled The Comfort Women Justice Movement in San Francisco, the National Coalition in Diaspora Against Japan's Gendered Necropolitics, as well as a book project, Health Disparities in Immigration Politics in Cold War-Era Japan, The Case of Korean Diaspora Communities. Dr. Rabab Abdulhadi is founding director, senior scholar of the Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diaspora Studies program. And very quickly before I continue, Ahmed Studies has been putting out a really engaging series of open classrooms that are open to the public and that I encourage everybody to be checking out, just to show the kind of dynamic programming that we've seen making linkages across the Palestinian struggle. Before joining SFSU, Dr. Abdulhadi served as the first director of the Center for Arab American Studies at the University of Michigan, Dearborn. co-founding editorial board member of the Islamophobia Studies Journal. She co-authored Mobilizing Democracy, Changing U.S. Policy in the Middle East, and co-edited Arab and Arab American Feminisms, Gender, Violence, and Belonging, winner of the 2012 Arab American Nonfiction Book Award. Dr. Abdulhadi is also an advisor to National Students for Justice in Palestine and the SFSU faculty advisor to Afghan Student Association, the General Union of Palestinian Students, Muslim Students Association, and Muslim Women Students Association. Please join me in welcoming Drs. Abdulhadi and Kinokawa. Thank you so much for being with us.
Hi, thank you for having us. We only have 1 minute for the panel. So what we want to do is basically, I'm going to just say a couple of things and then pass it over to Tomomi, and then we can always have these discussions later on. I wanted to basically kind of like acknowledge again that San Francisco State sits on the stolen indigenous Ohlone people's land, that we are very, we thank ASA, we congratulate ASA for winning the lawsuit against lawfare, and we also thank ASA and especially Dylan Rodriguez for coming up with the idea of Freedom School. That is something, a very important idea that has been also implemented not only in by SNCC in the South during Jim Crow and the refusal for the right-wing white supremacists to accept the ruling of the Brown versus Board of Education 1954, but it also was implemented at San Francisco State as experimental college by the Black Student Third World Liberation Front, who started the 1968 strike, and actually many of them were former members of SNCC, as well as the Black Panther Party and other revolutionary movements. And what we are doing with our open classroom is sort of reproducing this idea to be able to actually bring the community to the university, bring university to the community, to be held accountable to our communities and to engage with each other. Obviously, this is something that's very problematic for Zionists, for right-wing, and for neoliberal forces. So we don't really have a lot of, we were going to actually talk about maybe the last part. What does it mean for neoliberal? And what does it mean for liberal thought? And how does this speak about it? Because other things have been discussed, but I really want to pass it over to my comrade and my colleague and my friend. And we've been struggling in the trenches together, fighting charges of criminality, material support for terrorism, trying to deal with a very hostile university, trying to survive as human beings and to survive ourselves and also our students who are quite anxious and troubled not only by COVID-19, but also the cancellation, not even having a platform for us to be able to teach on. So I'm going to pass it over to Tomomi, and we can just basically like do the presentation some other time. We don't have enough time to actually do the presentations we wanted to do. So maybe we can just have a discussion with folks. So Tomomi, over it.
Thank you so much, Rabab, and also thank you so much for to organizers. And it's just such an honor and privilege to be in this distinguished panel and learn about this very important history. And so it's been really amazing experience. And so I guess as Rabab said, like since we don't have much time, I just want to say that the collaboration with Dr. Abdulhadi started spring 2020, and we were able to have, two open classrooms together in spring, and then 2 open classrooms again in this fall, and focusing on Palestine feminism, militancy, and academic freedom, and also state repression, pinkwashing, and queer feminist resistance. That was in spring, and then we had the censored webinar, Whose Narratives, Gender Justice and Resistance, a conversation with Leila Khaled. And then the second one, which actually did happen, was Queer Justice Now, challenging pinkwashing, white supremacist, Zionist, and Islamophobic narratives. And I guess I would just say that, as Dr. Rabab said, like it was very exciting and like such an honor to work with Rabab to prepare all these classes, and then it got censored, and so it's just, I think I'd like to kind of talk, to say like how much intellectual labor and also how much like innovative pedagogy that Dr. Abdulhadi brings to us, like that I think like yeah, like the whole thing was like silenced and shut up, which was just quite extraordinary experience. And so I just want to say that, and then maybe yeah, we can have discussion. I don't know what's your proposal.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would love to hear a bit more about what you were saying about the context of how this is sort of a response to the neoliberalization and privatization. I don't know if either of you would like to speak to that for a few minutes, because I do think it's something that really hasn't been touched on completely yet, and it would be good to hear from your perspective, as educators, as pedagogues, and as organizers as well, because that's part of the shift that I think we really need to be aware of. And honestly, if there's any other gap in terms of thinking through these issues that is kind of present right now that we need to fill in, right? Because of course we talk about repression, but maybe there's ways that factors we don't take into account when we think about repression. So if you'd like to say anything along those lines, I think it would be great to hear.
Do you want to go first, Amanda? You want to go first, or you want me to go first?
Go ahead.
Okay. So I think one of the major issues that we have been really struggling with, in addition to the silencing, the fact that we could not even have a venue for our classroom. We've asked the university multiple times to provide us a venue. They refused to give us a venue, and they kept directing us to talk to the AT. And we talked to the AT, and the AT says to us, no, this is on your own. You can do your own private affair on Google Meets or Microsoft Meets or whatever, but we cannot. They have an exclusive contract with Zoom, which is also a very important thing, though. Does this mean when the university actually has an exclusive contract, number one? Secondly, what does it mean when the university actually accepts the conditions by the private company that actually holds us captive? Because we are in COVID times, and this is how we can have our communication line. And everybody even says Zoom call, as if we're saying Kleenex for tissues. I mean, this is becomes, but also there is the inability for people to imagine that there was something before Zoom, and there could be something after that, and that we do need open source. So that's one of the issues. And so for us, it was really, really problematic for the two of us. We were not able to reach the 1,500 people who registered for the webinar. We weren't able to reach the 4,000 people who registered. As you know, ACT-IL went on and basically shut down and got Facebook and YouTube to shut us down. But the biggest problem is really is how our university has dealt with it. And the second biggest problem is how people who are looking at it are also dealing with it. So there has been a pass given to the university president because she says, I support academic freedom. People just believed it. And when people say, I support academic freedom, doesn't mean they actually support it unless they actually provide the material resources to have support for academic freedom. So the university president never ever talked to either one of us at all. Throughout the whole thing, never ever called us and said, hey, come, you're my colleagues. Why don't you come and have a discussion? What were you thinking? We did hear from some people in the community who were saying, oh, this is a distraction. Why are you doing Layla Khaled? This is kind of like touching the taboos. You shouldn't be doing it. This is not something acceptable. We reached out to multiple people, and a lot of people were having hesitancy about that, which also goes to the point of what is the civility discourse that we're supposed to be engaging in? What are the boundaries to discussing things around Palestine? What are the boundaries? Are we allowed to discuss everything about Palestine? I'm not saying we are allowed, because obviously neither of us asked for permission. We believe this is what we need to do, and we believe that we really need to push our students and provide for them such amazing luminaries that they would never ever be able to see, because we are at a poor campus. Students don't have money. They have 3 or 4 different jobs. They have financial aid. They've been kicked off the library. They've been kicked off the internet. I mean, our students are really, really suffering. So for us to actually be able to provide them with that was a huge treat for the students. Okay, and you know, I mean, maybe Tomomi can also speak about that, but the students really loved that. So we were actually just showing the film, the critical film, Layla Khaled Hijacker. The students found it very critical, but then we actually brought the actual people to come in. And both of us, and this is the other problem, is that both of us were constructed as if we are too naive and too innocent, starry-eyed. We did not really know what we were talking about. that we are just sort of enamored by Layla Khalid and so on, and we didn't have critical minds. And we're both very much engaged in gender and sexuality critical studies. We're very much engaged in critical ethnic studies. That completely went out the window. And then part of the discussion that happened afterwards is that, and I think this is one of the things we need to think about, is that people started discussing, is this terrorism, is it not terrorism? So actually part of the discussion happened on the terms of the Zionist right-wing groups that invoked this, and the Rick Lampone, and also nobody even asked the university president, why are you reproducing all this Islamophobic, Orientalist, racist, Zionist discourse as if we are post 9/11, 2001 George W. Bush or Ariel Sharon? I mean, it's very, very problematic. It's very problematic for the university president to say, I support academic freedom, but it's very problematic for the provost to say to us, we heard from groups and individuals that this is problematic and might be support of terrorism. Therefore, you might be engaged in criminal activities. You might even be in prison, and you should go and find your own lawyers. I mean, these are issues that many people kind of like, okay, we want to focus on Zoom. Yes, we do want to focus on Zoom. We want to hold Zoom accountable, and Zoom should not have the right to be able to actually silence our classrooms or shut us out or veto the content, because that is the violation of academic freedom and curriculum development. But what is the role of the academic institutions then? What are we doing? I mean, we've been spending our time, Tomomi and I, ever since this, before actually it happened, when we first heard, we announced it September 2nd, our university president September 5th went and wrote something. And then September 14th, she wrote something for J Weekly. Then the same day she was, Lawfare came out with its attack. The same day also she was congratulated by the San Francisco Jewish Federation. Okay, that raises money and so on. All of this stuff keeps happening again, and I did not talk to any of us, did not talk to any of our students, did not talk to anybody in the university at all, to the union, to anyone else. She said, I'm talking to Jewish students, but she was only talking to Zionist students, to Hillel. She was not talking to anyone else. And we've been spending our time to kind of like running. I mean, really, we were running like as if we are trying to cross a checkpoint from one place to the other, in order for us to be able to have this webinar afterwards to kind of like deal with the repercussions, deal with all of this stuff and so on. And I think this is one of the biggest issues that we want to raise is, what does this mean? What does it mean if somebody claims to be liberal, yet also implements a neoliberal agenda of privatizing the university, gives exclusive contract to these things? Why would private companies like Zoom or Facebook or YouTube, why would they not do what they are doing if we are not actually going to hold them accountable? That's the only way. During the South African anti-apartheid movement, that people used to say corporations for social responsibility. I mean, that's what they were saying. So where is the social responsibility here? And now we hear Zoom is kind of like trying to buff up itself, brings Janet Newell-Tino to be on this board, Zoom CEO is running around and so on. This is really very troubling. So the question is, what does this mean? And I'm going to stop and turn it over to Tomomi. You can also share more things that we have been actually dealing with as we're trying to, deal with our classes.
I just want to say that we had when we had the 2 open classrooms in spring, we had such a amazing reactions from our students, and they really I was very much impressed the way the students were really were able to kind of they were like able to understand the nuances and like complexities of of the narratives of resistance, and like a feminist and queer narratives of resistance. And then they really appreciated like the way in which Dr. Abdul Hadi critiqued the film in a constructive ways. And so I just want to say it was a huge loss. Like it was a lost opportunity to reach out to all these students, like over 150 students in our classes, and then 1,500 people who registered for the whole webinar, and then we all lost them. And then we haven't. we are not able to reach back to them because the university hasn't given us the information about the people who registered. And so that's another. And then so our second webinar was also impacted because of that. And it's just a very like one after another, there are technological issues that we had to deal with, and it's quite overwhelming and like kind of very exhausting. And then there are also students, assistants who have been really pivotal in these webinars, and so they had to. I mean, they did so much for this too. So I just want to mention that too.
And I would just should add that actually also part of the problem too is even after we had all these statements that people signed, and went to the university president actually came back and she cited as legal authority this very right-wing person who actually wrote articles against Stephen Salaita, so justifying the firing of Stephen Salaita, wrote an article against the Edward Said search at CSU Fresno, and now is writing against us. And she said, oh, he praised me. Of course he's going to praise you. But the problem is that we're actually trying to challenge our university, but at the same time, we're actually facing a very hostile work environment. Because in addition to what we are, people really need to think about the work that also it takes for us to meet with our students, to try to do the webinars, to try to also hold on to them, to try to assure them that everything was okay and so on. And if people have seen the webinar, actually part of the reason that we weren't on the screen, Tomomi introduced me, I was supposed to speak, and then I said, no, I'm going to pass it over to the students, because there were people who were emailing us in the morning saying, I can't register. What can I do? Because Zoom went ahead and actually either the university or Zoom, we don't know, sent email to all the registrants saying, you canceled the webinar in my name. They actually sent it to everybody else saying, and we're trying to still find out from the university, what happened? How did this happen? How did this happen in our name? What's going on? We're trying to get the AT to kind of work. They're not working with us. At the same time, we're also, we should really add this also to the whole environment about Ahmed. And what does it mean to have open classrooms? And what does it mean to actually be able to engage with the community and not to do only our scholarship in our own like cubicles and write and so on, but really to be active scholars? What does this mean? Because Ahmed's courses, two courses were canceled, 2 Palestine-centered courses were canceled for the fall in spring under the guise of COVID-19, the Palestine mural, and comparative border studies, Palestine and Mexico. Then the university went ahead and canceled my other course, which was Intro to Arab and Arab American Feminism, which was the basis for the 2 classrooms that I was going to do with Tomomi. Now we also find our classes heavily reduced. We also find, and maybe you want to talk about this, that even our own scholarship is being questioned. So this is, and by the way, somebody said that the sabbatical, I also was denied the sabbatical, I was denied the leave. Now they're getting Ahmed courses by half. So we now have only half of the courses they are offered. This is kind of, and we had all these emails coming at us right before the webinar as well. And so I think one of the issues, and I think one of the issues also is that, what does it mean to have this presentation? What does it mean to be able to have that? What does it mean to also kind of like there is this appearance of the fact that half of the panel that was going to converse with Layla Khaled were 2 anti-Zionist Jewish scholars, Ronnie Kasriels from South Africa and Laura Whitehorn, very long-time prisoner, 14-year, very active prisoner working on releasing aging people from prison. We also had the director of the Institute for Women's Studies at Birzeit University, which is one of the premier institutions, actually it is the premier institution for the production of knowledge on gender and women's studies in the whole region, not only in Palestine, Rula Abu Daho. And we also had Seiko Odinga, who spent 33 years in prison, who was one of the leaders of the Black Liberation Movement, who was at the time, who continues, which was also part of the oral histories that we were passing from one place to the other. So we were trying to engage in producing knowledge in a different manner than the ways that it is traditionally seen and conventionally done. We were really trying to do the freedom schools, the experimental college, to really hold ourselves accountable. All of this stuff, we had questions. The Zionists sent us questions saying, ask Layla Khaled about this, ask Layla Khaled about this. And I immediately wrote them back and I said, well, why don't you come to the webinar, ask her yourself? You're more than welcome to come and ask her. We're not going to block anybody. We weren't going to silence the chat. We were going to allow everybody. And there were tons of Zionists signed up for the webinar, which we checked before. We should have downloaded all of this stuff, but we didn't have time because we were trying to search for other platforms. But I think also there is a question about what's legitimate knowledge for women and gender studies. And I think maybe I want to throw it back at you, Tomomi, to kind of raise some of these questions in general that are historically part of colonial feminism and that continue with us today.
Sure. So I think the one of the issues that came up was that there was some internal pressure that pushed me. I mean, questioned me if the webinar really fits into my syllabus, which is Women and Gender Studies Introductory course. And of course, yes, it sure does. Palestine Arab American feminism is essential part of U.S. feminist history, of course. And so, but then there was a question and exceptionalized the webinar and also the topic and delegitimize teaching Palestine in the context of women and gender studies, and I think the students in my classes are do you know better than some people were pressuring us, and they actually they were making they were making connections between say what they are learning from our classes to Black feminist traditions, or there are many other feminist traditions that they were learning, and they were able to see that vital connections. And so I think
I know there are certain things we can't actually discuss here, but this is about the whole question. I mean, this is supposedly the 100th year of suffrage, of the US celebrating suffrage, women's suffrage, and so on. And you'd think after 100 years and multiple quote unquote waves of feminism and women's studies and so on, we've gotten past the idea that there are certain issues that are women issues and other issues that are not. I mean, you think that we're actually past it and that we are not going to engage in what white people say white fragility. I mean, kind of people will actually understand that and understand that all issues should be discussed and all issues are up for discussion. So there was the criminalization of Palestinian expressions of feminism and womanism and gender and sexuality. There were also criminalization of us who were trying to teach this. There was trying to present us as if we are naive, starry-eyed, we didn't know what was going on. There was a lot of invisibilization of Tomomi. I mean, we actually had an interview with the university paper, and then there is no comments from Tomomi at all. Completely, they were completely dropped. They happened in many, by the way, in many sites and so on. And I think parts of it is sort of I guess I would say for the Palestinian movement, it's as if we don't even believe our luck, that we are actually in the same trenches with people struggling with people day in and day out. And I think there's kind of maybe requires sort of an imaginative conceptual shift in our minds as well to kind of I mean, the whole question we were asked by multiple people, and I guess the reporter did not like what Tomomi was saying. Because, so do you want to speak about that, Tomomi? And then maybe we need to wrap up.
So, I'm sorry.
Remember the Golden Express reporter? You don't remember? When he asked you, it's kind of are you surprised? Are you surprised that there was an attack? And you were saying, look, I'm dealing with the Comfort Women Justice Coalition. I'm dealing with Japan.
Yeah. So I think, I'm sorry. I think there's what I felt was more people who want to take the Zionist framework. I'm inconvenient because I don't fit into this, this whole issue is a conflict between ethnically defined communities, right? And then these ethnically defined communities, they are homogeneous and they take this side and that side. And then so they're where do I fit? And and my voice is totally inconvenient and insignificant. I think that's part of what happened at the newspaper. And I was talking about how I myself I'm coming from Japan, and I have Japanese citizenship, and I critique my own government too, like around the issue of conflict of women justice. And so I was talking about it, and yeah, they are listening to the student journalists are listening to it, but they didn't want to include it. Like, I think in the beginning, they had a quote from me that they shared with us that they were going to use it. And it's more about the indivisibility of justice that, Dr. Abstrahadi emphasizes. And then, so I was talking to that, and in bringing my own experience with my own my communities, and how I connect those movements, and but they didn't want to include it, and so. Yeah.
I think just one more issue before we take off is the whole question of how do we deal with the question of critical ethnic studies. I'm actually speaking to some of the points that our colleagues spoke about already, and so the whole question of what's happening in California now with ethnic studies, and the ways in which there is an attempt to divide and rule that historically has been part of the discussion, because there is the whole question of kind of like alliances, working together, thinking of ourselves as part of the same place, which I think also the Zionists are very upset about, because the webinars we had, like the one we had on Black Lives in July, we have now over 9,500 views on Facebook. We've never, we have no money. All of it is organic. All of this stuff is just whether people participate or not. But I think they're very much upset with it. And they were also very upset the week before we did the webinar on Sabra and Shatila with survivors, witnesses, scholars, and it was incredible. And actually to speak also to another point, I think David Lloyd talked about the megaphone. They were saying, don't shut down the microphone. Don't shut up the microphone. And so but at the same time, we're also seeing now the whole question of divide and rule in ethnic studies, in the sense in which that actually scholars of ethnic studies in various universities are told, are you going to allow Palestine, Arab American, Islamophobia, and so on to be discussed, Arabs, Muslims, and Palestinians, or do you want your programs? Decide. What is it that you want to do? So the whole chilling effect of McCarthyism, and the whole question that comes also by liberals, I would say, by the way, we're not even, sometimes we're not even talking about like Zionists or right-wingers, not necessarily. I'm talking about people who want to protect their own careers, and don't want to lose the fellowships, and don't want to lose the grants, and don't want to lose the promotions, and don't want to lose whatever, all the goods that comes out of institutional, sort of like thinking about the institution is giving us things, not that we earned it as workers, as academic workers. So the whole union stuff also goes out the window. But they're telling them, do you want your programs? Do you want your programs in ethnic studies, or do you want to include something around Palestine? You decide. You want to include something about Palestine? We're going to deal with you the same way we dealt with SNCC back in 1967. We're going to deal with you the same way we dealt with other professors like Sam Anderson, Fred Dubé, they lost their jobs, and later on Stephen Salaita. But I'm actually talking about non-Palestinians who are working in the movement. Or do you want to have Palestine, or do you want to suffer the same fate that the parents, the community parents, Black and Puerto Rican community parents in Ocean Hill, Brownsville suffered, where Al Shanker, printed 500 leaflets, anti-Semitic stuff in the name of the community, which was not really the community. You need to decide what you want to do. So the stakes are really high. I think it's just kind of like what happened with the webinar, maybe exploded everything, put it out there, but the stakes are really high. What are we going to do? Are we only going to be actually holding accountable the targets of the Zoom and the multinationals and so on, or are we going to hold also accountable our liberal colleagues and administrators who are facilitating and enabling this to happen? Because if we're not, this is it. I think little by little it's going to go away. So, this is a very, very serious question. The answer for us is, of course, we will. But the question for everybody else is that the costs are really high. So what are we going to do about it?
I'd like to thank both of you for your comments and for your insights. And instead of a more formal closeout, what I think is actually maybe more valuable is to ask folks to, just for a few quick minutes, what do you have any recommendations or asks in terms of solidarity or accountability moving forward, right? What can be done to challenge this type of repression? What do you feel like you need from the broader movement, from people who are interested in really offsetting this type of silencing and repression? what would you say that is? And we'll start with Drs. Abdulhadi and Kinokawa, and then branch out to the other speakers. And I think with that, we can have probably a more intentional
Professor
closeout.
Kinokawa, my comrade to mommy.
I think we have a very logistic issue for keeping teaching, because like a Zoom, if we don't use Zoom and then university doesn't support us, there's no way for us to keep teaching. And also I'm bothered by some of the silence among my own colleagues, and also some of my colleagues who are taking the side of Zionists, and that is, so there's work that needs to be done, and so yeah, that's I think there is a collaborative work that needs to be done to make people accountable for their attacks on Ahmed and Dr. Abdulhadi on SFSU campus, and I was quite shocked. Like some of the colleagues whom I respected are kind of part of the attacks, and so that's something we really need to deal with urgently. And I think more voices are necessary to correct the injustice and violence. And so
I would just add to that we really need people to participate in exposing this PR spin that the university is trying to engage in, and actually make them be held accountable. If San Francisco State is really for academic freedom, they need to renegotiate the contract with Zoom. They need to actually not make it impossible for us to have our classes, and they need to stop their attacks day in and day out on the Ahmed studies to kind of gut it in order to make it a more palatable, acceptable sort of tabula research kind of thing. I mean, and people know what I'm talking about, right? So we need that pressure to come to bear, because at the end of the day, there might not be a program for us to fight about. I mean, I think it's really, really important not only to hold. Okay, we can't just hold Zionists accountable. You also need to hold people who are enabling things on a local level accountable. I think we perfected, I will say also about Palestinians. We're actually really good about that in Palestine. So now we do hold people accountable in Palestine, even in the party politics here. We did hold Engage accountable, and we exposed Engage, and that the Muslim community actually rose up and did that. We really need to do that on our own campuses. We can't just accept it and say, oh, this is such a nice person because, it looks like the university president cries when there is a budget crisis and so on. Not for her, by the way, for us. Okay, but then also, and then she says about, it's true, by the way, Nora, she did cry. Okay. And I mean, it's a very serious problem. It's a very, very serious problem, because we are also treated as the terrorists. Tumomi and I now are also with Layla Khalid are the terrorists we are the nasty ones. We are demanding too much. We have the audacity to raise all these questions and so on. We need to know our place and stop being so uppity. I mean, this is really the message for us. Know your place. Stop being so uppity. And we're saying, we don't think there is a particular place for us. We think all the places are our places. We're going to go into speaking up, but that really requires a lot of support, really requires pressures, really requires exposing this kind of like liberal facade that everything is okay. It really is not okay. Something needs to happen. And I think we are kind of like at a place where this is happening, and we need the support from everybody. We need them to implement the demands that we have. We need to build a program. We need to teach the students. We need to engage in scholarship. We need to live. We need to be able to sleep. So that's what we really need from all of you.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to add anything? Closing recommendations, needs for moving forward?
I can comment. I just would encourage people to just continue to speak out and to remember to center Palestine while you're speaking out, because I think to the extent that people, continue to say what they're saying and educate people, it's going to be harder for the opposition forces to silence people. And also they're going to understand that they are unsuccessful, because to the extent that anyone steps back and stops speaking out, or directs their focus to something else, it empowers the people who are trying to silence. And so they're going to get more resources to be able to silence. And, we already see the Lawfare Project bragging about how they were able to censor Dr. Abdul Hadi's webinar. And, that's going to be a way that they can fundraise to try to silence people more. And so to the extent that people continue to speak out and are not engaging in self-censorship in particular, I think that that is going to increase the resilience of the movement as a whole.
Yeah, thank you. It's been tremendous listening to everybody today. I just want to go back to a comment that Nora cited about how it's necessary to stop organizing on private property, which I thought was a wonderful way to frame this. And of course, we all know that although universities are supposed to be public spaces, they actually operate as private insofar as they are institutions of private property. And that makes me really think this is a struggle that is one aspect of the desegregation of the university, which is an ongoing struggle that affects all of our communities. And in one respect, the censorship of the SFSU panel that Tomomi and Rabab organized is a warning. It's a warning that says first they come from the Palestinians, and then they will come for Black Lives Matter, and then they will come for us. But it's also a signal. And I think it's a signal about the ways in which the Zionist movement, which as Bill reminded us, and as Rabab and Tomomi experienced with the Zionists attending the event but not being willing to speak, that Zionism is running away from debate. And it's running away from debate, as several of you all said, because the facts are against it. And each time there is debate, the facts come out further. And it really is, the other side of this is that panels like this indicate to me again and again that BDS has always been a site of thinking and a site of transformation, that in everything that we do, we have to learn, we have to reinvent, we have to re-theorize everything. And that's part of the process of being in movement. And I think insofar as we can make our movement, as we have always sought to do, part of a larger movement of desegregation, both of the university and of the society, of a tearing down of walls, then in fact these moments of attempted censorship become actually ways in which we can develop our critique in alliance with other movements that are affected in the same ways by this larger picture of privatization. And so I just want to thank Keith and Omar for giving this opportunity for us to think together, and hopefully in company with all those people who are not visible to us, who are actually watching this and then will continue to watch it in the future. Thank you. I think this is really important as a statement about the way in which we will not be censored. And let me just remind everybody, it's just one side note. Canary Mission is a fabulous archive. If you want to find my article, Attacking Carrie Nelson as a Lackey of Power, go to my site on Canary Mission. You probably won't find it anywhere else. But they are doing a wonderful job for us. And in fact, there's
David, Amcha does too, by the way. Amcha does too. Amcha and Campus Watch also. They all compete in archiving. So, yeah.
I just want to end on a note of thanks. I would like to thank Keith for co-organizing, Keturah and Brendan for providing the ASL interpretation, and especially I'd like to thank all of the panelists, not just for participating here today, but for all of your ongoing work. And thanking the viewers for tuning in, but also hoping that everybody who was moved by the things that were said today doesn't let today be the end, right? Continue supporting all of the different individuals and organizations that were talked about, continue supporting those who fight for Palestinian liberation, and resist the types of exceptionalization that I think Dr. Sinakawa and Abdul Hadi were talking about too, right? Where there's a sort of line where things can stop all of a sudden. It's no, it's not really about, patriarchal oppression. It's not about, colonialism. It's about something else where the discourse is flipped. This is all an interconnected form of repression that is, this was mentioned by Abdul Hadi, right, about the indivisibility of justice. When we have that frame, things are unstoppable, right? We really can't be stopped once we move forward with that in mind and continue to support one another's work and one another's efforts. So, and I hope that this will be not the end, but the beginning, of these conversations continuing in ASA as well, because I think that this is fundamental to Arab American studies. And thank you all again for your time. It's been a pleasure, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your days.